Samuel, but to the masters he was just a prize asset, a 7-foot 6-inch mountain of pure, silent power. And his silence was the price of peace. But what happens when the most powerful man on the plantation is pushed too far? When a master's cruelty targets the one thing the giant swore to protect? On a sweltering Tuesday, the overseer raised his whip one last time, and the mountain finally moved. Samuel didn't roar, he simply walked, and the man who ruled by fear looked up to see his entire world crumble, witnessing a force of nature that tore down the master's house with its bare hands and snapped chains like thread. This is the true story of the giant of Virginia, the man who chose to die free rather than live in chains, and whose single act of defiance sparked a revolution. Don't let this story be forgotten. Tap the screen right now to watch the full, incredible saga of Samuel, the man who terrified the powerful, and subscribe for more untold history.
History has a way of smoothing over the mountains and filling in the valleys, leaving a flat, forgettable landscape where titans once walked. It gives you names like Jefferson and Washington, men of power and property, but it rarely whispers the names of those whose very existence was a contradiction to the world those men built. It does not tell you about the men who were myths in their own time, legends spoken in hushed tones in the flickering firelight of the slave quarters. This is one of those stories, the story of a man who was a mountain, a walking testament to the fact that you can own a person's body, but you can never truly own their spirit. Our story begins not in a grand hall of politics, but in the sweltering, soul-crushing humidity of a Virginia tobacco plantation in the year 1858. The Croft Plantation was a sprawling scar of red earth and green leaf carved into the Virginian countryside. It was ruled by a man named Elias Croft, a man whose stature was as small as his cruelty was vast. He was a man of inherited wealth and deep-seated insecurity, the kind of man who measures his own height by the depth of the boot print he can leave on another's back. His power was absolute, his word was law, and his law was enforced by the biting kiss of the lash, wielded by an overseer named Silas Blackwood, a man with vacant eyes and a heart made of stone. On this plantation, human beings were listed in the same ledger as livestock and equipment, their value calculated in dollars and cents, their lives a relentless cycle of sunrise toil and sunset exhaustion. But among the assets of Elias Croft, one was not like the others. He was a man known simply as Samuel. To call Samuel a large man would be like calling the sun a warm light. It would be a truth so profound in its understatement as to be a lie. Samuel stood 7 feet and 6 inches tall. He was not a lanky, awkward giant, but a colossus forged in hardship, with shoulders as broad as a cabin door and hands that could form a watermelon as if it were a peach.
When he worked the fields, his shadow did not merely follow him. It consumed the rows of tobacco plant, a moving eclipse that blotted out the very sun that beat down on the backs of others. The other enslaved people moved around him with a mixture of reverence and fear. They saw in him a strength that defied their condition, a physical tower so immense it seemed to be a mistake of God, a divine protest against the wretchedness of their lives.
They would tell stories about him. They'd say his mother, before she was sold down the river, had prayed to the old African gods for a son who could not be broken. They'd whisper that when he was born, the midwife fainted at the sight of his hands, already as large as a grown man's. He was their folk hero, their secret legend. He was the giant who lived among them, a quiet, walking myth. Samuel himself rarely spoke. Words were a currency he could not afford to spend wastefully. His voice, when it did emerge, was a low rumble, like distant thunder promising a storm that never came. He moved with a deliberate, almost mournful grace, a being too large for the world he was forced to inhabit. The doorways of the cabins were too low, the tools too small, the world itself a constant chafing reminder that it was not made for him. Yet he never complained. His power was a silent thing. He used his immense strength not for defiance, but for service. When a wagon wheel was mired in the thick Virginia mud, it was Samuel who would put his shoulder to it, his muscles cording like ancient tree roots, and lift it free. When a heavy timber needed to be moved for a new barn, two men would strain and fail, only for Samuel to lift it alone, his face a mask of serene effort. Elias Croft, the master, saw Samuel not as a man, but as a marvel, a prized beast. He would often bring guests from Richmond to watch the giant work, pointing him out from the veranda of the great house. "Look there," he'd boast, swirling his brandy. "More strength in that one buck than a team of oxen. A true marvel of nature, is he not?" The guests would murmur in agreement, their gazes a mixture of fascination and revulsion. They saw a spectacle, a freak of nature. They did not see the deep, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. They did not see the soul simmering beneath the surface, a quiet fire banked low, waiting for a wind to stoke it into a furnace. The overseer, Silas Blackwood, saw Samuel differently. He did not see a marvel, he saw a threat. Power for a man like Blackwood was maintained through fear. A man on his knees is easy to control. A man looking down at you from a height of 7.5 feet is something else entirely. Blackwood could not whip Samuel into submission like the others. The act itself would be an absurdity, a flea attacking a bear. To strike Samuel would be to reveal his own pathetic inadequacy. So he compensated with a venomous cruelty directed at everyone but the giant. He would whip the smaller, weaker men in Samuel's presence, his eyes flicking towards the giant, searching for a reaction, a crack in the stoic facade. He was daring the Titan, testing the bars of his invisible cage. Samuel would only watch, his jaw tightening, his great hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, the knuckles like polished river stones. He understood the game. His inaction was the price he paid for the relative peace of others. If the giant remained dormant, the overseer's rage was at least predictable.
This fragile, terrible balance was held in place by years of unspoken understanding. Samuel would do the work of 3 men, and in return he was largely left alone, a caged lion who was too magnificent and too terrifying to provoke. The other slaves looked to him for a strength they couldn't possess, and he gave it in the only way he could, by enduring. His stillness was a form of protection. Then came the girl, Ilara. She arrived with a new purchase of 5 souls from a failed estate down county. She was young, perhaps 16, with eyes that still held a spark of life that the Croft Plantation specialized in extinguishing. She had a spirit that had not yet learned how to bow, a quiet resilience that manifested not in defiance, but in small acts of kindness. She would share her meager rations with the older folks. She would sing soft songs in the evening that reminded them of homes they could barely remember. In a place starved of beauty, she was a wildflower growing in a crack in the stone. Samuel watched her from a distance. He saw the way she helped an old woman, Martha, whose back was bent with age, carrying her water pail. He heard her humming a tune his own mother used to sing. A forgotten warmth stirred in his chest, a protective instinct that went beyond the general guardianship he felt for his people. He saw in her a flicker of the world as it should be, a world of gentleness and grace, not of whips and chains. Silas Blackwood saw her too, but he did not see a wildflower. He saw a new toy to be broken. Her spirit was an affront to him, a challenge to his dominion of misery. He began to single her out. Her row was never straight enough. Her pace was never fast enough. He would loom over her, his voice a low, menacing drawl, his presence a suffocating poison. The other slaves would lower their heads, their hearts pounding a rhythm of fear. They knew this ritual. They knew how it ended. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The air was thick and heavy, promising a storm. Ilara, weary from the heat, stumbled while carrying a heavy basket of tobacco leaves, spilling a portion of its contents onto the red dirt. It was a small thing, an accident born of exhaustion. For Blackwood, it was the opportunity he had been waiting for. "You clumsy wretch!" he snarled, his voice cutting through the humid air. He strode over to her, his whip uncoiling from his belt like a striking snake. Ilara scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I'll pick it up," she stammered, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the scattered leaves. "You'll do more than that," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He raised the whip. The sound of the air parting was a familiar, sickening song. The old woman, Martha, cried out, "No, sir, please!" It was in that precise moment that the world on the Croft Plantation shifted on its axis.
Samuel had been working at the far end of the row, his movements rhythmic and powerful. But at the sound of Ilara's cry and the whistle of the whip, he stopped.
His head, which was usually bowed in labor, slowly lifted. For the first time in years, he turned his full attention to the overseer. He straightened to his full, impossible height, and the sun, which had been at his back, was now behind his head, creating a terrifying, awe-inspiring silhouette. He was no longer a man, he was a figure of judgment, a shadow that had come to life. He took a step. The ground seemed to tremble, then another. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. Each of his strides covered 10 feet of ground. The other slaves froze, their mouths agape, their eyes fixed on the impossible sight. It was as if a mountain had decided to walk. Blackwood, his arms still raised, heard the heavy, deliberate footfalls. He turned, and the smug cruelty on his face dissolved into a mask of pure, primal fear. He had spent years prodding the giant, and now the giant had finally turned its gaze upon him. Samuel didn't shout. He didn't roar. He simply walked, his eyes locked on the overseer, and in their depths was a cold, calm fire that promised an end to all things. He stopped a few feet from Blackwood, placing himself directly between the overseer and Ilara. He was so close that his shadow completely enveloped them both, plunging them into a sudden, cool darkness. He said nothing. He simply stood there, a wall of flesh and bone and righteous fury. The whip in Blackwood's hand seemed like a child's toy. His authority, his power, his entire world built on fear, crumbled in the face of a greater fear. Blackwood's hand trembled, the whip falling limp. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked up and up and up, into the face of the man he had tormented with impunity. And for the first time in his life, Silas Blackwood, the enforcer, the breaker of men, was utterly, completely, and profoundly terrified. The giant had awakened, and in the suffocating silence of that Virginia field, everyone, from the smallest child to the master watching from his porch a half-mile away, knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Time itself seemed to hold its breath in that Virginia field. The humid air, which moments before had carried the whistle of the whip and the gasp of terror, was now thick with a silence that was heavier than any sound. It was a silence filled with the frantic beating of a dozen hearts, the rustle of tobacco leaves in a sudden breeze, and the low, ragged breathing of a humbled overseer. Silas Blackwood stood in the giant's shadow, a man shrunk by fear. His whip lay in the red dust like a dead snake. His authority, the only thing that gave him substance, had evaporated into the oppressive heat. He finally took a stumbling step backward, then another, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. He did not turn his back, an animal instinct warned him not to, but retreated, step by cautious step, until he was clear of the giant's immense reach. Then, and only then, did he turn and walk.
not with the swagger of an overseer, but with the hurried, graceless shuffle of a defeated man, disappearing toward the distant white speck of the great house. Samuel did not watch him go. His duty was done. He slowly turned, the motion as deliberate as the turning of the earth, and his eyes fell upon Ilara. The girl was still on the ground, looking up at him not with fear, but with an expression of profound, tear-filled awe, as if she were gazing upon a biblical protector sent from heaven itself. He extended a hand to her, a hand so vast it could have crushed her, yet his touch was impossibly gentle. He helped her to her feet, his fingers barely grazing hers, and then, without a word, he bent down, gathered the spilled tobacco leaves, and placed them back in her basket. He looked at her one last time, a barely perceptible nod, and then turned back to his row. He picked up his hoe, its wooden handle like a toothpick in his grasp, and resumed his work as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The other enslaved people stared, their tools idle in their hands. They had just witnessed the impossible. They had seen the sun stand still. They had seen the river flow backward. A man of their own had faced down the whip and won, not with violence, not with words, but with the sheer, undeniable power of his presence. He had not struck a blow, yet he had landed a hit that had shattered the very foundation of their world. A wave of understanding, of dawning, terrifying hope rippled through them. They looked at Samuel's massive, laboring back, and they no longer saw just a marvel of nature. They saw a king.
From the veranda of his mansion, Elias Croft had watched the entire scene unfold through a brass spyglass. He had seen his prized giant stop work. He had seen him confront the overseer. He had seen Blackwood, his enforcer of order, retreat like a scolded dog. Croft lowered the spyglass, his knuckles white. A vein throbbed in his temple. But his emotion was not simple rage. Rage was a luxury for lesser men. Elias Croft was a businessman, and what he saw was not a rebellion, but a complication on a balance sheet. Samuel was his most valuable piece of property, worth upwards of $2,000, a fortune. To kill him or maim him in punishment would be an act of financial suicide. You do not put down a prize-winning bull for goring a farmhand. You reinforce the fence. He summoned Blackwood to his study, the room filled with the scent of leather-bound books and bourbon. The overseer stood before him, head bowed, stained with the humiliation of his public defeat. "He must be made an example of," Blackwood spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. Croft swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes cold and calculating. "And who, Silas, do you propose will wield that whip? You? Do you think your arm would even reach his back? Do you think the others would stand by and watch you attempt it? No." He took a slow sip. "You have been clumsy. You have prodded a sleeping lion, and now you want me to shoot it because it has roared at you? That is not how power is maintained." "Then what?" Blackwood demanded. "We do nothing? We let him think he can defy us?" "I said nothing of the sort," Croft replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Power is not about the whip, Silas. The whip is a crude tool for crude men. True power is about control. It's about understanding what a man values and then threatening to take it away. Our giant has shown us his weakness today. It is not his back or his pride. It is them. He gestured vaguely with his glass towards the fields. He has made himself their protector. Very well, let him feel the price of that protection. In the days that followed, a strange new order descended upon the Croft plantation. It was a kingdom with two rulers. In the great house sat Elias Croft, the master of the ledger and the law. In the slave quarters there now reigned a silent king. Silas Blackwood no longer patrolled the fields where Samuel worked. He directed his petty cruelties elsewhere, but the heart had gone out of it. His power was a ghost, a hollow thing that everyone knew to be a fraud. The true power now resided in the quiet dignity of the giant. The other slaves began to orbit Samuel. They would leave a portion of their own food by his cabin door at night, a piece of cornbread, a boiled potato. The old woman, Martha, would mend his rough spun shirts, her fingers working deftly to patch the fabric that was perpetually strained at the seams. They did not speak of the incident in the field. They did not need to. It was a shared memory, a sacred event that had bonded them together. When they looked at him, they saw their own strength magnified. They saw their own anger given form. He was their walking declaration of war, and they, in turn, became his silent, devoted court. Samuel felt the change like a physical weight upon his impossibly broad shoulders. He had not sought this. He had acted on an impulse as pure and unstoppable as a tidal wave, the need to protect the innocent. Now he was no longer just Samuel. He was a symbol, a shield. Every glance from his people was both a tribute and a plea. Protect us. Every small gift was an oath of fealty that bound him tighter to their fate. He started to speak more, not in long speeches, but in short, rumbling phrases of advice or comfort. He helped a young man mend a broken tool. He lifted a fallen log that blocked the path to the spring. He would sit with the children in the evenings, and they would clamber over him as if he were a gentle hill, their laughter a strange and beautiful sound in that place of sorrow. He found himself often near Ilara. A quiet understanding existed between them. She would bring him a gourd of cool water in the heat of the day, her eyes conveying a gratitude that words could not hold. He, in turn, would find himself subtly positioning himself near her in the fields, a silent warning to any who might harbor ill intent. He saw in her spirit the very thing he was protecting. Not just her body from the whip, but the spark of humanity that slavery was designed to extinguish. He was guarding a flame, and it was giving him a warmth he hadn't realized he'd lost. But a shadow cannot exist without a sun, and a king cannot rule without a rival. While Samuel's silent kingdom grew in the quarters, a serpentine plot was being hatched in the great house. Blackwood, consumed by a venomous need for revenge, watched the giant's new status with mounting hatred. He couldn't attack the mountain, so he decided he would poison the ground on which it stood. He began to sow whispers of dissent. "He's putting us all in danger," he would mutter to a trusted sycophantic slave. "When the master finally tires of him, the punishment will fall on all of us. He is not a savior, he is a curse." He tried to turn their fear of the master against their reverence for the giant. Croft's plan, however, was far more insidious. He waited. He watched Samuel become more and more entwined with the community, more and more the heart of his people. He let the roots of their hope grow deep around the giant. Then, when he judged the moment to be right, he acted.
One Sunday, a day of supposed rest, Croft ordered everyone to assemble in the main yard before the great house. A pair of slave traders from Richmond were there, their faces impassive, their clothes reeking of cheap cologne and greed. A cold dread washed over the assembled people. Assail was the deepest wound, the tearing of families, the final brutal proof that they were nothing more than property. Elias Croft stood on his veranda, Blackwood at his side, a smirk now firmly back on the overseer's face. Croft let the silence stretch, savoring his power. He looked over the crowd, his eyes eventually landing on Samuel, who stood at the back, his height making him impossible to miss. "There has been a disruption to the order of this plantation," Croft announced, his voice carrying with an unnatural clarity. "An act of insubordination that cannot go unpunished. But I am a merciful man." A bitter laugh caught in a few throats. "The guilty party is too valuable to be disposed of. Therefore, the price must be paid by others. A debt has been incurred, and today that debt will be settled." He paused, letting the horror sink in. Then he pointed, not at Samuel, but at the old woman, Martha, the woman who had mended Samuel's shirts, the woman who had cried out for Elara. "Martha," Croft called out, "and her son, and his wife, and their 2 children, sold to settle the account." A collective gasp, a wave of pure agony swept through the crowd. The family clutched at each other, their wails beginning as a low moan and rising to a desperate shriek. The traders moved forward, their chains rattling. Samuel stood frozen, a statue of disbelief. This was a cruelty beyond the whip, beyond any physical pain. It was a spear thrust directly into his heart. Croft was punishing him by destroying the very people he had sworn to protect. His strength had not saved them, it had condemned them. Every act of defiance, every moment of shared hope, was now being paid for in the currency of shattered lives. The traders put the chains on Martha's son. The children were screaming, clinging to their mother.
Samuel watched, and something inside him, a dam of restraint that had held for a lifetime, finally broke. The distant thunder in his soul became a roaring, deafening storm. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists the size of cannonballs. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. He was no longer a protector. He was an avenger. His eyes, burning with a fire that had been stoked for a lifetime, were fixed on one man, Elias Croft. He was no longer a silent king. He was a revolution about to begin.
The world, which had shifted on its axis that day in the tobacco field, now began to spin apart. Samuel's first step forward was not a step of aggression. It was a tectonic plate of history grinding into motion. The sound was not of a footfall, but of a promise being broken. The unspoken promise of submission that had held their universe together for generations. The assembled slaves, who had been a huddled mass of sorrow, now became a silent, petrified audience to the end of the world as they knew it. The wails of Martha's family were cut short, replaced by the sharp, indrawn breath of 100 people watching a god declare war. The two slave traders, men accustomed to the casual brutality of their trade, were the first to react. They saw not a righteous man, but an asset in revolt. One of them moved to block Samuel's path, raising a short, thick cudgel. "Hold, boy," he commanded, his voice laced with the false confidence of a man who had never been disobeyed. Samuel did not slow. He did not even seem to register the man as an obstacle. He simply raised his left arm, not in a strike, but as a man might brush aside a curtain. The trader was thrown backward 5 feet, landing in a heap of stunned disbelief, his cudgel clattering uselessly on the hard-packed earth. The second trader, seeing this, fumbled for the pistol at his belt, but he was too slow. Samuel was already past them, his gaze locked on the veranda, on the source of the poison. His every movement was imbued with a terrible, patient certainty. He was not a man in a rage. Rage is hot and quick. This was something colder, older, and infinitely more powerful. It was judgment. He reached the foot of the veranda steps. Elias Croft, for the first time in his life, felt the icy grip of his own mortality. He was a man who moved mountains with the flick of a pen, who destroyed families with a quiet word. But he was now faced with a mountain that had come to him, and he had no words left that could stop it. "Blackwood!" he shrieked, his voice a thin, reedy thing. "Shoot him! Shoot him now!" Silas Blackwood, who had been paralyzed by a mix of remembered fear and a dark, thrilling excitement, finally drew his revolver. He raised it with a trembling hand, the barrel wavering as he tried to aim at the center of the giant's massive chest.
Samuel did not look at him. He placed one enormous foot on the bottom step of the veranda, and with a heave of his shoulders, he drove his foot downward. The wood splintered with a sound like a gunshot. He did it again, to the second step, and then the third, not climbing the stairs, but obliterating them, leaving a trail of shattered timber in his wake. He was unmaking the master's world from the ground up. As he reached the top, Blackwood fired. The shot was deafening in the sudden silence. A red flower bloomed on Samuel's shoulder, a shocking splash of crimson against his dark skin. He grunted, a low sound of annoyance more than pain, and, for the first time, turned his head to look at the overseer. He reached out, his hand engulfing Blackwood's entire arm, and squeezed. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. The revolver dropped from nerveless fingers. Samuel shoved the man aside, and Blackwood collapsed, howling and clutching his ruined arm. Now only Croft remained. The master of the plantation was backed against the white wall of his own house, his face the color of ash. Samuel advanced, the blood from his shoulder dripping a slow, steady rhythm onto the pristine floorboards of the veranda. He stopped directly in front of Croft, so close that the smaller man was completely trapped. Samuel was panting now, great, deep breaths that sounded like the bellows of a forge. "You," Croft stammered, his mind grasping for the old words of power. "You are my property. I will see you hang." The giant slowly raised his hand, and Croft flinched, expecting a blow that would surely kill him. But Samuel did not strike. Instead, he reached past Croft and wrapped his massive fingers around one of the veranda's main support pillars, a thick, white-painted column of solid oak. He braced himself, and with a guttural roar that seemed to tear from the very center of the earth, he pulled. Wood screamed in protest. Nails shrieked as they were torn from their moorings. The entire roof of the veranda groaned, sagged, and then, with a deafening crash, a section of it tore away from the main house and collapsed into the yard below, showering the ground in a cascade of shingles and splintered wood. Samuel stood amidst the ruin he had created, holding a 10-foot section of the pillar like a war club. He had not merely attacked a man, he had torn down a piece of his house, a symbol of his dominion. He turned back to Croft, who was now weeping with terror. He leaned in close, his voice a low, thunderous whisper that was for Croft alone. "You own nothing," he rumbled. He then turned his back on the broken master, a final act of contempt, and walked to the edge of the ruined porch.
He looked down at his people. They stared back, their faces a mixture of terror and ecstatic hope. He saw Martha's family, still shackled. He leapt from the veranda, landing lightly for a man of his size, and strode towards them. He took the chain that bound Martha's son, gripped it in his 2 hands, and with a surge of power that corded every muscle in his body, he pulled. A single link of forged iron, thicker than a man's thumb, groaned, warped, and then snapped with a sharp crack. He was the breaker of chains. He was their liberation made flesh. He then looked to the crowd, his eyes finding Ilara's.
He saw the fire in her, the same fire that now burned in him. He raised the broken chain in one hand and the massive pillar in the other. "He will not stop!" Samuel's voice boomed across the yard, for the first time addressing them all as a leader. "The dogs will come. The patrollers will come. We can die here in chains, or we can run for our lives. To the north, to the river and the great swamp. Run now!" It was a spark landing in a field of dry powder. A moment of hesitation, and then a cry from someone in the crowd, and then another. It was a dam breaking. Ilara was the first to move, running to Samuel's side. Then Martha's family, then a dozen others, then 2 dozen. They surged forward, a chaotic, desperate tide of humanity, choosing a chance at freedom over the certainty of bondage. A mass exodus had begun. They fled. Across the tobacco fields, trampling the master's cash crop under their bare feet, and into the dense woods that bordered the plantation. Samuel was their shepherd, their rear guard, his massive form a rallying point. He guided them toward the great dismal swamp, a place of legend, a treacherous primordial wilderness where the slave patrol's horses could not follow and the dogs would lose the scent in the murky water. It was their only hope. Hours later, the posse arrived. Led by a now one-armed and half-mad Silas Blackwood and a hastily deputized group of neighboring planters, they were a force of pure vengeance. They tracked the fleeing slaves to the edge of the swamp. Most of the escapees, the smaller, quicker ones, had already been guided by Ilara deep into its embrace. But Samuel knew he could not hide. He was too large, his tracks too obvious. He was the target. He had to be. He sent Ilara on with the last group, his voice soft for the first and last time. "Go," he said, "keep them safe. Tell them there was a giant who walked in Virginia." She looked at him, her eyes full of a history he had rewritten, and then she was gone, swallowed by the cypress trees and hanging moss. Samuel turned back to face his pursuers. He made his stand in a clearing, the murky water up to his knees, the massive oak pillar held firm in his hands. When the posse broke through the trees, they saw him, and for a moment they stopped dead. He did not look like a man. He looked like something that had risen from the swamp itself, a primal spirit of defiance. He was covered in mud and blood, his eyes burning with an unholy light.
"He's there! The beast!" Blackwood shrieked, his face contorted with hate. "Fire!" The volley of rifle fire was a ragged thunderclap. Samuel roared as bullets tore into his flesh, but he did not fall. He charged. He swept the oak pillar like a scythe, and the front line of the posse dissolved into screams of pain and broken bones. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of desperation and fury. He fought not for his own life, but for the lives of those who were now deep in the swamp, for every minute his stand could buy them. He fought for Ilara. He fought for the memory of his mother. He fought for the simple, beautiful, impossible idea of being free. He fought until the last of his strength was gone, until the clearing was littered with broken men, until Silas Blackwood lay dead with his skull crushed.
And then, wounded in a dozen places, he finally staggered back into the dark water of the swamp and was seen no more. They searched for his body for 3 days. They found nothing, no trace, no giant. Elias Croft's plantation never recovered. His great house stood with a broken veranda, a permanent monument to his humiliation. His story became a cautionary tale whispered among the powerful, a reminder that some things cannot be owned. But among the enslaved people of Virginia, a different story was told, a legend. They said the giant had never died. They said he still walked the great dismal swamp, a guardian spirit for all who sought freedom. They said that on quiet nights you could hear the sound of his footsteps like distant thunder, and the snap of breaking chains on the wind. The story was passed down from one generation to the next, a secret history of defiance. He was no longer just Samuel. He was a myth. He was a promise. He was the walking embodiment of a truth more powerful than any master or any whip, that within the heart of the oppressed there can grow a spirit so large, so powerful, and so determined to be free, that it can tear down the house of its master and walk away into legend. He was, and forever would be, the Giant of Virginia.